Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us today for the Beetle-mania webinar. My name is Brianna Widener and I'm the Outreach and Education Specialist for the Washington Invasive Species Council. And for those of you who don't know, the Council is an interagency organization and we are created by the Washington State Legislature to provide policy-level direction, planning, and coordination for combating harmful invasive species throughout Washington. And we also prevent the introduction of other invasive species that could pose a threat to Washington. And today we're lucky to have Maggie Freeman, Chris Looney, and Todd Murray joining us to teach us about a few invasive species to be on the lookout for. Maggie Freeman is an entomologist with the Washington State Department of Agriculture and a master's student at Washington State University. Chris Looney is an entomologist for the Washington State Department of Agriculture, where he manages the Washington State Department of Agriculture insect collection and entomology laboratory. And then finally, Todd Murray is the Agricultural Natural Resource Program Unit Director at Washington State University Extension. Todd's a member of the Washington State Invasive Species Council, and he utilizes the resources and networks at higher educational institutes to advance the mission of the Council. So at this point, I'm going to pass the mic over to our first presenter, Maggie Freeman. I hope you all enjoy the webinar.
Hello, and thanks for joining us today. I'm going to start us off with talking about the lily leaf beetle, whose scientific name is Lilioceras lilii in Washington State. So this beetle is indigenous to Eurasia. It is in the Chrysomelidae family, or the leaf beetle family, and outside of its native and naturalized range, it is a major pest on species of Lilium and Fritillaria, both genera within the Liliaceae family. So both the adult and larval life stage of this beetle will feed on the leaves, the flower buds, and the flower petals of their host plants. And since many lilies are grown for their aesthetic appeal, they are a major garden pest. They can consume all of the leaves from the plants, and sustained damage like this can kill the plants after several years. So this beetle was first found in North America in Montreal, Canada in 1943. It was thought to have been brought over through the importation of Asiatic lily bulbs from Europe. It was then later found in the United States in Massachusetts in 1992. From these locations, they've since been spreading throughout the eastern states and provinces. Then for the first time on the West Coast, the beetle was found in Bellevue, Washington in 2011. So these beetles are pretty easy to spot. They are bright red. The adults have a red back, a black head, and black legs and underside. They're about 6 to 8 millimeters long, or roughly 1/4 inch. They can be found just hanging out on lily plants in the middle of the day, just in the bright sun, so they're easy to spot, though if you get close, they'll often jump up or jump off and fall belly up, so you can't see them anymore. They'll start emerging in the spring, so you can start finding them as early as March when your lilies are first starting to emerge. And then if you get close to them and they feel threatened, they'll also make this kind of cute squeaking noise. So each female can lay anywhere from 200 to 300 eggs in a season, so you can see how their population sizes can quickly increase by just having a few beetles in an area. These eggs are found on the underside of the leaves, often laid along the mid-vein of the leaf. You can find them generally in clusters of 3 to 12. When they're first laid, they're bright orange, and then as they mature, they'll turn into a rusty red, and then the new larvae will emerge in about 8 to 10 days. So the larval stage is definitely the most damaging stage of this beetle. They can consume entire leaves, and as they feed, they cover their backs with a layer of their own excrement, creating a fecal shield of sorts. This fecal shield is thought to protect them from generalist predators, things like lady beetles or green lacewings. It's also thought to protect them from desiccating in the heat of the summer, since they are found in the spring and the summer seasons. They start out very small and grow to a large stage where they can consume entire leaves on their own, and this will take them about 3 to 4 weeks. So once they're ready to pupate, they'll dislodge their fecal shield and climb down the stalk of the lilies and move into the soil. In the soil, they'll glue together soil particles with their saliva, creating a nice pupal case. And within this, they go through metamorphosis and then will emerge as the new generation of beetles about a month later. These beetles will then feed on the lily leaves until the fall, and then the adults will overwinter either in the soil or they can fly to leafy debris in the nearby location. So just to go through their life cycle again really quick, and this is specific for Western Washington because we have a milder winter and are finding them earlier than on the East Coast. So the overwintering adults will start to emerge in March as your lilies are popping up. They will then start to mate and lay eggs about 2 weeks later. The eggs have been reported on lilies anywhere from April through July, so you can see they're laying eggs throughout the season. These eggs, which emerge in about 8 to 10 days, will then turn into the larvae. The larvae can be found anywhere from May until August, and then they will pupate, and the new generation of adults will be found anywhere from June to September. So you'll see kind of a drop in the adult populations during the growing season, and then all of a sudden a ton more adults feeding starting at around June. They will then overwinter and then emerge again the following spring. Oops, sorry about that. All right, so Washington State is one of the top 5 producers of lilies in the United States. So this specialty crop industry will definitely be impacted by this new pest. Home gardeners have already reported digging up their lily bulbs, thus shrinking the consumer market. And then from the research on the East Coast and experience with this pest, they found that they will feed on our native lily species. They've already found them moving into natural settings on the East Coast. So this is definitely bad news because many of our lilies are already threatened or endangered. So after this beetle was reported in Washington State, the Washington State Department of Agriculture wanted to figure out what different plants the beetle could feed on now that it's found in Western North America. So we did feeding and egg-laying trials with several of our native species. This included our native tiger lily, Lilium columbiana, the hairy pussycat ears, Calochortus tolmii, and the chocolate lily, Fritillaria finis. We found that the beetles will happily lay eggs and feed on our Lilium columbiana, and that larvae can easily complete their life cycle on this host plant. The Calochortus tolmii, which is a genus only found in the western United States, was not a preferred host plant, but they would lay some eggs on them, and the larvae were able to complete their life cycle on these plants as well. And then Fritillaria finis also didn't seem to be preferred, but the larvae could complete their life cycle on those as well. So that's definitely bad news for these host plants. And we're definitely going to be encouraging plant enthusiasts that happen to be looking for these plants when they're out in the wild to be keeping an eye out for the beetle moving on to them. So if you find this pest at home, one of the best things you can do is just hand removal. So going out there as frequently as you can and collecting the adults, the larvae, and the eggs and squishing them if you're okay with that, or knocking them into a bowl of soapy water. This needs to be performed throughout the season to really knock their populations back. And if you can get out there early in March before the beetles start to lay eggs, you can really knock their populations way down. An organic insecticide that seems to have some effect against the beetle is neem oil. This can be sprayed on the underside of the leaves. It seems to only really be effective on the small larvae, so it won't kill the adults, and it needs to be reapplied throughout the season as new larvae hatch, and then also after a heavy rain. There are broad spectrum insecticides that can kill both the adults and the larval stage of this beetle. However, they are not specific to just this beetle, and since you're spraying them on a flowering plant, this could also really affect our pollinators that come to visit that floral resource. And then another thing is biological control, which I'll get more into in a second. So that's going back to their native range and finding a natural enemy that helps keep the populations down there, and then introducing them here. So after the beetle was introduced and is well established on the East Coast and began to be a big problem, researchers went back to Europe, where the beetle rarely gets to nuisance levels, to see what natural enemies are keeping the populations low. They found 7 different parasitoids that attacked either the larval or egg stage of this beetle. After rigorous host specificity testing, they found 3 different parasitoid wasps that will only attack beetles in the genus Lilioceras. These were approved for release in North America because there are no native Lilioceras found in all of North America. So if these wasps were actually able to kill all of the lily leaf beetles, they would have no other host to move on to, making them a really safe option for release in North America. So these wasps were approved and were released at several places on the East Coast. They found up to 100% parasitism rates at the release sites, and that the wasps did establish and start to spread in the area. The one really downside about these wasp species, is that they're tiny. They're about the size of a grain of rice, so they can't spread very quickly, only like 1 to 5 kilometers in a year. So they're a really great, safe way to help reduce the beetle population, but it's going to take a long time for them to be able to spread to the entire invasive range of the beetle in North America. So we partnered up with the University of Rhode Island, and they've been sending us these wasps. We've started releasing them in 2018, and then again this year. We've now released roughly 400 Tetrascus setifer and roughly 50 D. jucunda. So as you can see, these wasps are tiny. So Tetrascus setifer can lay multiple eggs in the larvae of the lily leaf beetle. And just go through their life cycle. These wasps will start emerging as adults roughly in May, at a point when there's a lot of larvae present, lily leaf beetle larvae present in the field. They'll then find as many as they can, lay their eggs inside of them. The lily leaf beetle larvae will then complete their growth and move into the soil to pupate. And that's at the point where the wasp larvae will hatch out and kill them and consume the entire beetle larvae. They then have this nice pupal case to overwinter in. So in the overwintering pupa picture, that's about 12 of the T. setifer larvae inside of there. So kind of gross, but also pretty cool. So they will overwinter and then emerge again the following spring. So D. jucunda, who's also pretty small but a little larger, has a very similar life cycle as T. setifer. However, they lay only a single egg in each lily leaf beetle larvae. And after they hatch out, they will spin an internal cocoon inside of the beetle's pupal case. So that's pretty cool. So what we're asking people to do is help us track the spread of the beetle in Washington. So the Department of Agriculture created a lily leaf beetle report form where you can go take a picture of the adult, the larvae, or the eggs, upload it to this website, and include a general location, so even a cross street is fine. And then I'm able to go in, take a look at the picture, and verify if it is the lily leaf beetle or not. And then it'll show up as a positive site on our map. So we started this in 2016, and we just uploaded a couple of the first sites that the beetle had been reported from. And then as of this year, we've now had over 40 positive submissions to the website. Just a handful of unverified because they did not include a picture, but we've been able to track the spread north into Redmond, south into Renton, and then now we can see by the new spots in South and Maple Valley and all the way in Olympia that humans are involved with transporting this beetle to new locations. So please help us track the spread and submit any findings that you find. So thanks for your time, and I'll look forward to your questions after the other presentations.
All right, good morning. This is Chris Looney, Washington State Department of Agriculture. I'm going to tell you the story of European chafer in the Pacific Northwest. Well, really just Washington State. European chafer is a scarabid beetle, scarab beetle in the genus, or in the species Amphimalon majali. Please be aware that in the older literature, it was assigned to a different genus, Rhizotrogus. So if you see the name European chafer associated with that scientific name, don't be confused. What is it? It's a turf-feeding scarab, so your average C-shaped turf grub, about 1 inch long, with a brown, sort of drab adult, your typical June beetle. June beetle, this European chafer was native to Western and Central Europe. They're called June beetles because, like many other species that are closely related, they fly in June. Let's see if this works. There we go. And so this is a picture of a mating swarm in British Columbia. The adults are flying about. They are alighting on these trees where they hang out and meet prospective mates. And that's as good a place as any to begin our description of the life cycle. June beetles, again, because they're active from May through June into July, early spring and late spring through early summer. The adults are active for a couple of weeks. They fly for about 5 days. Once they have mated and are satisfied with their mating, the females alight on the soil surface and insert eggs into ideally some loamy sandy loams. Although, in a pinch, they'll lay their eggs just about anywhere that's available. They accomplish this by inserting an ovipositor. Let's see, does the arrow show up? Excellent. Inserting her ovipositor into the soil and expanding this organ at the end of it, which creates a little depression into which she can insert eggs. Between 20 and 40 eggs is the average amount of eggs laid by a European chafer female. The larvae hatch and immediately begin to feed on grass roots. They go through 3 instars, and in the winter, they overwinter in little earthen cells that they create out of some mucus from their salivary glands, and then go into a period of sort of hibernation. Or in places like us, like the Washington, where we have mild winters that don't freeze, they just continue slowly feeding throughout the winter. Pupate in the spring, and the life cycle starts all over again in May when the adults emerge to mate. You'll see some animals on here that are distinctly not European chafer, a skunk, a crow, and a mole, and that is because vertebrate predators are often attracted to these large populations, which takes us to the kind of damage these insects cause. They are a turf-feeding pest, so they cause damage really similar to that you might see from something like a crane fly. They feed on lawn and pasture grasses. They've been known to feed on some cereal species, so there may be economic impacts that we don't really know of yet in the Pacific Northwest. And they cause the kind of dieback you would see with any of those other turf-feeding species. It might be hard to recognize, particularly here in Western Washington. That damage looks very much like a dormant lawn. People even have signs that say, "My lawn is dormant, not dead." So you might not know that you have European chafer first off. Most people recognize that they have European chafer damage when they see their lawn rototilled by hungry vertebrates. Populations of the grub can build up pretty high, and they become a veritable smorgasbord for crows, skunks, etc. Let's see if this works. Yeah, so here's just an image, a video of crows in the midst of the damage they've done, pulling up grass, looking for grubs. This was taken in British Columbia. I'll just let this play for a second. This crow on the left is particularly vigorous. It's about to fling a piece of grass off to the left. So again, you wake up in the morning and your lawn looks like this, and it didn't look like that the night before. This might be why. But just to show you another upside of this, this may even expose you to wildlife encounters that you never thought you could get in the suburbs. These are bears doing damage in British Columbia as well, in one of the northern suburbs. That grass is not going to recover without some help. So in North America, they've been in North America since the 1940s. The first detection was in New York. Pretty soon after, there was a federal quarantine established, and that lasted until the 1970s. And they have now spread west to Michigan as of 2000. And the main way they spread was through turf transport or flying into people's cars during their swarming period. These are just some comments that accompanied that early chafer quarantine. Focus on this bit. Neely Turner in 1956 says that the European chafer is even more important to agriculture than the Japanese or Asiatic beetle. This was based on the extreme damage that was being done to pastures and lawns in the area where they were established. Of course, not long after, people decided they weren't quite as bad as the Japanese and Asiatic beetles, and that is why we still have a Japanese beetle quarantine today, but not a European chafer quarantine. So despite the slow movement of this insect, it was detected in British Columbia in the early 2000s, where it has quickly spread and kind of blitzed the entire Fraser lowlands. WSDA conducted light surveys in Blaine the year right after and the next year, and we didn't find anything. We do pick them up periodically in Japanese beetle traps. So you may have seen these Japanese beetle traps. That's what this sort of yellow and green bomb-looking thing is, hung all over the state, and that is because there is still an active Japanese beetle quarantine. The traps are hung in places like airports and current neighborhoods, or not current neighborhoods, new neighborhoods, anywhere where the movement of Japanese beetle might be facilitated by human trade. And we typically find some of these in airports, it's hard to see, there we go. In airports, because they'll fly into planes early in the season before the East Coast starts their Japanese beetle exclusion practices, which include big nets that go around cargo planes. So in 2016, it all changed in Washington for us. We detected a couple of Japanese beetle traps, or a couple of European chafers and Japanese beetle traps. Not a big deal. Like I said, we typically will get a few here or there. Those are kind of far from the airport. But really, 2 and 4 is nothing to worry about. 54 was alarming. 119 Japanese European chafer was very alarming, and by the time we got to over 1,000 for the area, we were pretty sure we had an infestation. That very same year, we started getting the first reports of people wondering why their lawns were ripped to shred overnight in the area of SeaTac adjacent to the airport. We conducted a couple of surveys, started asking people to tell us when they detected the insects or if they thought they had the insects. And this is what the current distribution of European chafer looks like in Washington to the best of our knowledge. These points are color-coded by their first year of detection. And you can see in 2016, these sort of purplish points. The infestation that we could find was pretty much confined to this SeaTac area. By 2017, we were realizing it had grown much farther. 2018, there was a population well established in Kirkland, probably taken there by turf. By 2019, it had reached the bottom of Des Moines. So really evidence that this beetle is being moved both by human activity and by natural spread outward. So how would you know if you had European chafer? Well, the best way to know is if you wake up and this is what your lawn looks like, and it didn't look like that the night before. But what if that's just what your neighbor's lawn looks like and your lawn is still pretty pristine? The standard practice is to dig a little turf patch. Let's see, there we go. Management standards in the United States are based on a 12 by 12 square foot area. This is how you do that. You just cut a little square of grass, pull the grass back, and look for grubs. And there you can see. They are very easy to spot, even at relatively low numbers. And there are some recommendations that you can find online that track how many grubs you find per square foot. Low numbers, they say don't worry about it so much. High numbers, probably you should be irrigating your lawn, doing other cultural practices, which I will approach in just a second. One thing to keep in mind, we have many other species of white grub beetle that essentially look very similar. Including some natives and other introduced species. The character you really want to look at is what's called the pattern of the spines on the raster. So this is the butt end of the insect, essentially, right here. And you're going to look for these kind of spines and what sort of pattern they have. And European chafers is pretty distinctive. It forms what is described in literature as this gradually opening zipper, in contrast to the sharp triangle of a Japanese beetle or the long oval pattern of one of our native species. So if you dig up your grass and find a big beetle, don't panic until you look at the raster. How would you control this beetle? So certainly you can try to control the vertebrate predators. That's not going to work in the long run or even the short run because they will just fly right back in. There are control options that span cultural control, pesticide application, and biological control. We'll start with cultural controls. The #1 recommendation is to make your lawn resilient to European chafer depredation. That means having the lawn watered really well and fertilized properly to make it able to grow root material quickly and resist the insects nibbling away at their roots. That is sort of the opposite of how we manage lawns in Western Washington most of the time, where we just give up in the summer. So there will be a water cost for this. The other way that many people are using is to simply change their lawn entirely, replanting it with more resistant grasses and especially clover mixes. The insects will nibble on clovers, but they don't seem to do the same level of damage or build up to the same high populations when they have a clover-dominated lawn. Often, people have also just ripped out their lawns entirely or replaced it with like AstroTurf. I guess that saves on mowing. There are commercial nematode cultures available. If you were to look at this on the internet, you'd find that the efficacy is debated. This is probably because these take a lot of work to get nematodes thriving in your soil and attacking European chafers regularly. You really have to baby them. You have to provide enough water for them to move. You have to make sure the soil conditions aren't too dry or too hot. And it can be a real challenge for management. Essentially what these nematodes do is they will crawl around in the soil. They enter the insect through a natural opening like the spiracles. Once inside, they begin releasing a bacteria, a symbiotic bacteria that kills the insect, and then the nematodes are essentially in their dinner for the next couple of generations. They multiply inside the insect and move on to the next European chafer grub. And so that's where maintaining those conditions throughout the nematode's life cycle can be challenging. And of course, there is simply commercial lawn care. There are granular pesticides that are labeled in such insects or such sites, and they're pretty effective. There may be local restrictions on using those. For instance, most of the British Columbia suburbs, where this has been a problem for a while, have simply banned most lawn pesticides. I don't think Washington is quite so restrictive, but you may yourself not wish to use them. So if so, clover. All right, so we don't know much about, there are still a lot of things we don't know about European chafer in the Pacific Northwest. For instance, we're not really sure how it was introduced. It seems likely it flew in on planes. That question is literally quite academic now because it's spreading on its own accord and through human-assisted transport within the state. So closing down that pathway may not be very important anymore. We don't know much about the life cycle in the Pacific Northwest. It seems to be active longer in the season. As I said, we have mild winters that don't kill the insect off or drive it into dormancy. That is a little bit different than, say, European chafer in Michigan. We don't know if populations will naturally decline over time. A lot of invasive insects have large peak outbreaks and then dwindle with time. And that may be what they're observing in British Columbia right now. So this problem may work itself out over the next decade and a half. And finally, we don't really know what the extent of the range is in the Pacific Northwest. We're getting a lot of reports from the Seattle and SeaTac area, but that's because there's tons of European chafer. Perhaps they're in other places as well and simply haven't reached the level at which people would start noticing them and being concerned. And that is pretty much the end of the European chafer segment, and I'll look forward to looking at the questions you've asked towards the end. Todd?
All right. Well, thank you. My name is Todd Murray. I work with Washington State University Extension, and I'll be talking a little bit about Viburnum leaf beetle, the third beetle in the series. This beetle is an interesting beetle in the sense that you see this with a number of introduced insects where we first get a population show up into a new place, and sometimes it takes a while for that beetle or insect to establish and get acclimated to its new home. So this Viburnum leaf beetle was found in Ontario, Canada in 1947, and it wasn't until 1994 that populations were well established to expand across the border into the U.S. into Maine. 2 years later, it was found in New York, and since then has spread to the surrounding states. And right now, you can find this beetle in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, a number of the maritime provinces, Connecticut, Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Wisconsin. So it's making the same kind of steady track as lily leaf beetles are moving on the East Coast, spreading inland. We did, however, have a population pop up out on the West Coast in Vancouver in 2001, and 3 years later, it crossed the border into Washington State in Whatcom County in 2004. And the neat thing about this story is it was first noted by a master gardener at the WSU Master Gardener Clinic there in Whatcom County, and they recognized it as a beetle to be on the watch for, and alerted and got that first state record as it crossed the border. So the current distribution in the Pacific Northwest, we found it, if you look at the map here, the little triangles are Viburnum leaf beetle. So you can see that it's pretty well spread from the Canadian border, going through Whatcom County, Skagit, Snohomish, and is now in excellent numbers in King County and causing significant damage in King County. Thus far, I don't believe that we've had a report south of King County, but I won't be surprised if it's moved south. Also, during, I believe this was 2015, we had a population spotted in Spokane, Washington, and so it's It's well established in that small area of Spokane, Washington, and will likely spread out from there into neighborhoods and native landscapes. So looking first at the beginnings of the life cycle, the Viburnum leaf beetle overwinters in the egg stage. You'll find these in protected wounds that the adult beetle makes on the underside of last year's new growth. So essentially they look at that green tissue. The female makes a small ovipositional wound where she deposits 3 to 8 eggs into that egg pit, and then turns around, throws ups on it and poops on it, and makes a protected egg cap to overwinter those eggs in. It's likely this egg cap protects it from freezing damage and other predators and maybe some parasitoids. You'll see these eggs really evenly spaced on the underside of that twig, and you won't confuse this with anything else. It really looks unusual. When you visit a bush to look for these egg wounds, they might not be obvious because they're on the underside of the stem, but if you tilt your head a little bit, they'll pop out and look really systematically obvious because of how regular they space the eggs. Once viburnums wake up from overwintering and expand their leaves fully, that's about when viburnum leaf beetle time their egg hatch. And so the larvae will pop out of those egg pits once those first fully formed leaves pop out in spring, and they'll start skeletonizing on the bottom side of the leaf. And it depends where you are in the Northwest, but this can start happening as early as in March, but most commonly into May as viburnums wake up. Those teeny tiny instars are early instars are only about a fifth of an inch long, or excuse me, only about a 1/25 to 1/12 inch long, so they're teeny tiny. They're only about a millimeter or two when they hatch. They start off pretty pale looking in color, and you might see some really small spots on them, but they'll darken as they grow older and as they develop. So as they develop, they kind of get a more yellow color, and those sclerotized spots on their back become more pronounced, and they're almost look alligator skin in texture. As those larvae develop, they eat a lot more, and as they eat a lot more, they defoliate more, and you'll see those complete skeletonizing damage that they cause on the viburnum leaves as they develop. Once they've fed, in June, the mature larvae migrate down into the soil and compute. It's probably longer than this. They pupate in there for about a month in that transitional state between larvae and adult, right there in about the first top inch of soil right underneath the viburnum bush. What the larvae prefer to do is to walk down to the soil, so you can see them trekking alongside of the stems and walking down to the main trunk of the bush to get down to the soil line. They don't readily want to drop from the bush if they don't have to. Once they pupate, they emerge into these bronzy looking beetles. The beetles are about a fifth to a quarter inch long. Females are usually larger than males. But they'll get this kind of golden sheen or iridescence to them to make them look shiny. So they will have like a bronzy look to them with a little bit of a green sheen. Newly hatched beetles. There, hold on a sec. Newly hatched beetles will feed again on that foliage. Keep on feeding on there, and continue for quite some time until that that first killing frost. And a female can feed on up to that killing frost, and during that time she'll lay up to 500 eggs. So you can see, once they move to your viburnum bush, populations can get quite large pretty rapidly in a year or two. So again, they'll continue feeding on that foliage and egg laying until that first killing frost. Depending where you are, that can be October, November, and even going into December. Damage can be quite severe. This is one of the first bushes we found them on in Whatcom County. That's a high-powered line to give you some perspective. So this is a very old, very mature snowball viburnum bush, and beetles completely defoliated that bush. Here's another picture of a bush downtown Bellingham where beetles have defoliated that mature bush. Closer up to that damage, you can really see how the beetles skeletonize, so you'll be left with the veination left in the leaf and all the other tissue removed. So the damage is really distinctive. You won't confuse this with any other damage on viburnums out there. This is something to consider, because as this beetle moves in and attacks susceptible hosts, a viburnum bush, even one well established and very large, can't handle being defoliated twice in 1 year. So as those larvae first defoliate the bush, and then they go down and pupate, the bush will flush out some more growth of leaves, and then the adults come out and defoliate it again. And again, a mature bush, even one that's well established, won't be able to handle complete defoliation for consecutive years. And we've seen mature bushes die within about 3 years of these heavy infestations. So they can cause mortality even in those large older bushes. A great program was initiated at Cornell to engage citizen scientists to help determine which varieties are susceptible and which ones are resistant. I'll point you to some resources towards the end of my talk where you can learn more about these varieties, but you can see just some susceptible ones are arrowwoods, the cranberry bush, even our native one, and some of the other double file type viburnums, which I find very attractive. Some of the resistant ones are the more like the leatherleaf viburnums. Some of those viburnums that you see in every mall parking lot, those seem relatively resistant, but sometimes aren't the most flattering viburnums out there. Impacts on wildlife. Some really interesting observations have been made back east as these beetles established. Smith and Hatch did a study really to look at small songbird populations back east, and they were able to document a decrease in songbird diversity. They saw changes in capture rates of the different species of songbirds, and where they saw a drop in 69 species of songbirds and actually an increase in one of those species. So one species of songbirds may actually be utilizing viburnum leaf beetles to a larger degree, but you can see how other species have dropped off because they're seeing mortality of viburnum bushes. Probably one of the more disturbing finds that this study saw was after infestation of viburnum leaf beetles, they started to see no evidence in mass gain in these songbirds as they overwinter. Viburnum plants are a very important food source for overwintering songbirds as they feed on those overwintering berries. So this is having an impact on this level of wildlife, and you'll see other impacts as this species establishes. So I want to point you to our Pest Watch, Viburnum leaf beetle. You can download this at pubs.wsu.edu. You also find fact sheets of the other two pests, European chafer there and lily leaf beetle there. For current recommendations, I direct you towards our online resource, Hort Sense. Well, it'll give you all the legal and recommended management practices. But probably some of the best ways to deal with this pest as they come into your viburnums, much like the lilies, is to hand remove them when you can. You can put a tanglefoot barrier along the trunk of the viburnum bush to try and capture those migrating larvae down to pupation. But also go to Hort Sense and look at what the current pesticide recommendations or horticultural type oil recommendations we have there. We don't have natural enemies to the degree that lily leaf beetle does, where we can find a parasitoid to release and manage it just yet. But we do see generalist predators like ladybug larvae. There's some predaceous plant bugs that will also feed on them, along with some birds like chickadee type birds. So we don't quite have the hope for the level of biological control that we see with the red lily leaf beetle at this point. So just to kind of wrap this part up is really understanding who finds all these new bugs and what the condition looks like for new bugs entering our region. So just one quick example, and I should update this as there's a little bit older numbers, but since 2007, Jim Labonte down at Oregon Department of Agriculture has documented 66 new insect introductions since 2007. Washington State Department of Agriculture has documented over 70 new pest introductions since 1991. And Chris led a really interesting study looking back at who's actually finding these new insects. It's people like you that are contributing a lot to the identification and discovery of new insects as they cross into our state border. So in a quick study looking at how new pests have been recorded within Washington State, public entries coming through WSDA equated up to 13% of new identifications, and then public submissions through WSU Extension has added another 23%. So that's a pretty significant chunk to the pie of how new insects get discovered in our state. So to capitalize on that, the Washington State Invasive Council formulated a kind of more formal new network to kind of coalesce all these different outlets of observant folks like yourself to help discover new pests in Washington State. Because we all know early detection can possibly lead to a rapid response by an agency to help try to eliminate a pest before it gets too well established. Unfortunately, the pests that you've seen today are already pretty well established, and there's not a whole heck of a lot we can do to slow the spread except not move it around even more. So what you can do is in addition to reporting lily leaf beetles on the website that Maggie pointed you to, is go and download the Washington Invasive Species app. You can get this on Apple iOS by searching your apps on there, your app store, and also on your Android, and download the app. Here you'll be able to navigate which species you're seeding. You're able to take a quick snapshot of that species and upload it, and it'll document your record of that species. So all these species that we've talked about today, we encourage you to help us know when it's expanded the current range that we already know that it's in. So use this app to report on these species and any other of the priority species that the council have given. So we really like to recruit your help in finding species and become a first detector. And I'll tell you a quick story of why I think this is an important thing for all Washingtonians to be a part of. Back in 2009, a small, tiny little fruit fly was discovered in Seattle in 2009. This fly then spread quickly across our state and across the entire country, and is now infests small fruits all throughout our country and into Canada. In 2013, I got a call down in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. If you're familiar with that area, it's home to the Indian Heaven Wilderness area, where we collected berries and found both in that region of the Gifford-Pinchot in southwest Washington and in the Mount Hood National Forest in northwest Oregon. We selected sites in high locations to look for this fly, and found it in a number of locations and in pretty remote locations, all the way in high elevations. So this beetle quickly, or this fly quickly spread into all the little nooks and crannies even within our state, let alone across the entire country, and started infesting huckleberries at pretty high rates. And really the significance of this is this has been a resource of fruit that people have been utilizing for over 10,000 years, and now that fruit utilization is going to be forever changed. So reflecting on some of the other pests that we've talked about today, like the lily leaf beetle, not only does it impact the flowers and plants that we grow in our backyards, but it impacts our natural areas that are going to have forever and everlasting impacts on the natural environment. So with that, I'll turn it back to folks in Olympia. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Todd. And thank you to Chris and Maggie as well. At this point, we're going to open it up to questions. I'm going to change our screen there real quick. All right, so one of our first questions was back for Chris during the European chafer beetle section. And they were curious, you mentioned that the European chafer beetle is affecting pasture grass, and they're wondering, is there any indication it may spread to cereal grains such as wheat as well?
Yeah, am I still on this thing?
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely been observed causing losses and thinning in winter wheat in the Midwest. So the potential is there. It's not generally one of the most serious pests of wheat, but for some growers, it certainly has caused losses, and it remains to be seen what its impacts will be here. Not only do we have an enormously important wheat production on the eastern side of the state, but out here in western Washington, a lot of growers have been experimenting with other grains. So there's kind of a double whammy. Both are established, important, thriving resource, and then this new one that's trying to get off the ground. So there's definitely evidence that it can, and it remains to be seen how serious it will be.
All right, thank you very much, Chris. So you touched a bit upon this, Todd. You mentioned some good resources, but we have this question: what is the best source for identifying beetles on my property? So probably some of those hort scents and pest alerts you mentioned through WSU. Are there any other resources that folks should be going to for identifying beetles on their property?
Well, one good place to start is Washington State University has extension offices deployed all across the state, and within those offices you may find a program called the Master Gardeners. And Master Gardeners are a great first place to see if they can help you identify the beetle or any other insect or any other curiosity they find in your yard. And if they can't, they'll access the network of the university system and WSDA and even Washington State DNR to help get you an identification. So I would start at your local extension office.
All right, excellent. Anything to add to that, Chris or Maggie?
No, it trickles up to us and the other identifiers at WSU if they can't figure it out. So.
Mm-hmm. same thing with the Washington Invasives app that Todd mentioned. When people make a report through that, the Washington Invasive Species receives all of those reports, and then we send them to the experts, such as the folks we have on this webinar today, for identification purposes. So great question. Follow up to that, what are some native species that might be confused with each of the 3 species we discussed today, if any?
For the European chafer, there are just several brown beetles, and I don't know the names of all of them offhand. And then as larvae, there are even a few more of these just sort of general grubby-looking bugs that you can easily confuse. I don't know if that's very informative, but that's it. There are several.
Yeah.
Lily beetle, not many.
Not many, yeah.
If I recall, the only negative submission that Maggie received where somebody said, I think I have one of these, and it was definitively not, was what's called a net-winged beetle, which is a bright red forest species. It was pretty easily rejected. You know, it was easy to tell right away it wasn't a lily leaf beetle, but you know, at first glance, it looks a bit like one.
Yeah. And like ladybugs that don't have spots can be shiny and red, kind of similar, but they're so much more round, whereas the lily beetle's oblong. And with the lily beetles, if you see a bright red beetle and your lilies look wretched, it's going to be that. So.
On the east side of both states, in Washington, Oregon, there's a rain beetle that can sometimes get confused with European chafer, but timing of that beetle, and if you dive into some more of the characteristics, it's pretty easy to separate out. But if you're finding C-shaped grubs in turf areas, especially during the non-adult flight period, those are things to be very suspect, because there's not many other C-shaped grubs that you should be seeing in turf areas. Bill bugs are much smaller in the larval stage and often legless, so those are an easy one to separate out. And but yeah, so be suspect of any C-shaped grub that you might find in turf, because we're concerned about another beetle also in our state called Japanese beetle, which will look similar.
Okay, excellent. And I know that Chris mentioned that sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between this invasive or some just strange grubby looking brown beetles. If you're not sure, please still feel free to take a picture and send in a report so that we can verify it for you. Or like Todd was saying, taking it to a local extension office. We'd rather be safe than sorry. And we did have a question here that says, are there any reporting methods other than the app if you don't have that type of cell phone? And we do. If you go onto the Washington Invasive Species Council website, we have an online reporting form. And really the best thing you can do for us is include a picture. Without a picture, we can't verify a report. So if you have a camera and you want to upload that to your computer, that would work great. If you can take a picture on your flip phone and upload that to your computer, that's a great option as well.
And there's always simply calling or emailing us. That works, particularly for people that aren't really interested in smartphone or computer technology. So
correct.
I guess email still needs a computer.
But yeah, you can always call us as well. And again, photos or a specimen. Either.
Yeah, if you have a specimen, you can also drop those off at the extension office, and they'll route them through also.
All right, we have a couple more minutes here. So lily leaf beetle. Are there searches through nurseries, retail, or wholesale stores who distribute ornamental lilies to find sources of lily leaf beetle?
That's a great question, and currently no. We did send out an email to a giant listserv of all of the Washington State nurseries, letting them know that this beetle is now in Washington and to please be checking their lilies. Otherwise, there's no state mandated searches that they need to do or quarantines in effect to prevent them from being able to sell these lilies still. So if you're in a nursery and going to buy a lily and it looks kind of off, like some damage, alert the staff and have them take a look at it. And if they find any like major damage, they should send a picture to us, and then we can verify yes or no. But currently, there's no mandates.
But one caveat to that: nurseries are not supposed to sell plants that are infested with insects in general. There's not a specific one for this beetle. Although I may say we've done a lot of outreach, but nurseries generally aren't supposed to sell pestiferous insects in Washington or pestiferous plants in Washington. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Right, that's a great question. And now that you are aware of what it looks like, all the symptoms and signs of these beetles, you can be the first detector on that if you notice anything. All right, let's see. The invasives discussed today, as well as the mention of the spotted winged Drosophila, seem to have their first detections on the west side of the Cascades. Have any invasives been detected first on the east side of the Cascades?
Yes. Cereal leaf beetle is a classic example. That was one I think that we were expecting to move here from the east, and it was first detected in what, Spokane area, Todd? Do you remember? Is he not there anymore?
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Yes, it's Spokane.
Oh, that's a good example. That's kind of interesting. I haven't actually thought about it in quite that way. And so now I want to go and relook. We get a lot that are first detected on the west side. Part of that is because the entomology office here has traditionally looked around at little things that maybe aren't as important to Eastern Washington. So we just don't have the same ag pressure, so we have a little bit more freedom to look at other pests. And partially that is because of how many ports are in Western Washington. It's a major entry pathway at Tacoma and Seattle and Vancouver, Portland, as well as things moving down from British Columbia, which traditionally had a much stronger trade relationship with England, or maybe a more liberal trade relationship is the way to describe it, right after World War II. So there are multiple pathways that are occurring on the west side of the state that are different from the east side, which explains part of why species were first detected over here.
Yeah, Spokane has also been a location, so urbanized areas seem to also get more traffic. So both European chafer has been found by WSDA at the airport, and as I said, Viburnum leaf beetles happy and surviving just fine in Spokane area.
So the leaf beetles, the Viburnum leaf beetles over there are European chafer and spotted lily beetle on the east side yet?
Not yet. Yeah, the lily leaf beetle so far is just restricted to Western Washington.
Okay.
And we think the same for the chafer, but we're not really actively surveying for it. It's not a funded program. So.
Okay. All right. And then they were also wondering if there's a climatic difference that might bias detections to the more humid side of the state.
I don't know if it would bias detections, but it certainly makes the west side of the state pretty palatable for a lot more insects. One that recently has become established in western Washington is this, it's called the southern greenstein bug, or Nazara viridula. That's a species that's cosmopolitan. It's been in the United States since the 1700s. Traditionally, it hasn't been very far north because cold winters kill the adults. Our winters are not as cold as they used to be, and these adults have been able to overwinter successfully in Seattle. They're probably introduced all the time on boats, maybe even on plants. So it doesn't really change the detection capability, but it is a more friendly environment for a lot of species, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. One last quick question. Do you know if hydrangeas are hosts to any of these pests?
Certainly not for the lily leaf beetle.
I don't think so.
Probably not the viburnum.
Yeah. It's conceivable that the chafer would nibble on the roots, but they really aren't a pest of most shrubby plants. So.
All right, so your hydrangeas hopefully are safe from these pests.
Can I add a point before we leave?
Yeah.
Regarding back to that viburnum leaf beetle, Todd alluded to the fact that there's not really an effective biological control agent that's been identified for it. Dr. Gaylord Desermont, who works at the Montpellier, France, USDA Biological Control Laboratory, thinks that is because the searching in Europe has not been effective, and he would like to elevate that species for a closer, more targeted research program, particularly in light of the environmental impacts that have been observed on the East Coast and described to the beetle. So if you have records of Viburnum leaf beetle on your property or your garden or any place you manage, we would love to hear about them, both the species or variety of Viburnum and the kind of damage you think you've seen or that you are seeing and how long you think it's been there. That'll be really helpful in him building a case to spend some more time and money on that pest. So let us know if you have any data.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you again so much, Maggie, Chris, and Todd, for sharing your expertise with us today. This webinar will be added to our Washington Pest Watch webinar series on the Washington Invasive Species Council website, so you can go back and watch it at any point that you'd like. We also have other resources like this on there, other webinars and introductory trainings and brochures, posters, just a lot of great materials for anyone who's interested in invasive species and perhaps training others in being first detectors. So please make sure to check those out. And thank you everyone for joining us this time, and we'll see you again in the future.